It's Coherent Spintronics Group and a summer intern at the Institute of Science and Technology, IST, Australia, in Professor Georgios Nanoelectronics Group. Welcome, sir. Welcome to the event.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Yeah, please call me Praveen. Don't say sir.
Yes, without further delay, I would like to hand over the session to Mr. Praveen.
Okay, I'll start by sharing my screen. Can you guys see the slides?
Yes, the slides are visible.
Okay, cool. Okay, yeah, so thanks a lot for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak. It's a really it's really wonderful to talk about this subject and talk to you all. As Malvika mentioned, I graduated from IIT Bombay in 2019 with my bachelor's and master's, and currently I'm working as a PhD student in applied physics at Stanford. Just to briefly say that so while this is a very interesting this is a topic which is very close to my interests and work. I don't directly work like on quantum computing systems. My work is primarily on quantum materials and the devices or the hardware that is used, that would eventually be used to make quantum computers. But nevertheless, this was one of my most this was one of the motivating topics, the reasons why I got into this field. So it's nice to talk about this. And so I'm not going to make this technical at all. So I hope it will be accessible to everyone irrespective of your background. But at any point, you should feel free to. I don't think I can monitor the chats, but if you can put it on the chat and then someone can read it out to me or interrupt me at any point, then that's totally fine. Okay, with that, let's get started. And okay, so over the last many years, in fact, this has become such a buzzword, and you might have, before coming to this talk or this workshop, you might have had some notion of quantum computing, and that is thanks to the immense effort that is being put in throughout in the academia and industry towards building this device. And recently you might have also come across this term called quantum supremacy, and this is the reason why people are actually putting in their money and time to actually to invest and get into to work towards building a quantum computer. And it's the idea that that a quantum computer can outperform a classical one being the ones that we have, our phones, our laptops, our tablets, or our supercomputers. So the idea that a quantum computer can outperform a classical one, and that being measured by performance on a specific task. The reason why this is important is that quantum computers are not general purpose machines. So you should not think of, in a few years we'll have a laptop being sold which says it's a quantum computer, but you can use it to check your emails and do your calculations. I mean, it's a very, at this point in time at least, and perhaps for the far future as well, quantum computers are these devices or these computing machines which are built to solve a particular problem. And the reason why they would be useful, if at all, would be if they could outperform a classical computer on that particular task for which it was designed. But remember that in this definition of quantum supremacy, there is nowhere a requirement for this task to be useful. So we are still at the stages of research and development, where it's important to first get to the proof of concept that something you have that works in principle, and then it may or may not be useful, but once you can demonstrate the principle, you can take it forward from there. So along these lines, along these lines, so in in October 2019, Google had published this massive paper, like it's called Quantum Supremacy Using Programmable Superconducting Processor, where using their they call it their Sycamore chip, which is basically their it's their device that does quantum computing, which has 53 qubits. Now, what are these? What does this mean? I'll get to it eventually, but just wanted to flash something to get you started. And so, in October 2019, around 1.5 years ago, they published this, and they said that okay, so we have using this device that we have made in our lab, we have been able to do a task which has outperformed the best supercomputers to date, and this became instantly a big thing. Like all news are like it was a big thing in science, and it received a lot of media attention. And this also encouraged a lot more companies to chip in, and it's like it was quite a big milestone where you see claims of quantum supremacy and to achieve things which classical computers cannot. But before we get into understanding what this is, what this means, like why are people so excited about it, let's just take a step back and remind ourselves, or like recollect and get everyone on the same page about what do you mean by a quantum computer, or what is quantum? Like, why do you think about all this in this context? So very briefly, since we don't have time to go into everything, very briefly, I just want to abstract out what are the key aspects from quantum physics which makes it non-intuitive or different from the Newtonian mechanics that we learned from school. The three things which I think are, in my opinion, are the key to quantum computing per se are the first is wave-particle duality, wave-particle duality, like you may know it in the context of photoelectric effect, where Einstein showed that depending on the frequency of the light, you have particle. You can bombard it on a metal and shoot out electrons, or you can think of it as a matter wave, where everything, like matter, which we assume to be particles, are actually waves, and they can undergo interference, diffraction, and you see these double-slit experiments. The second is the idea of having quantized and discrete levels. I mean, whenever we studied classical Newtonian mechanics, we think of everything as continuous functions, right? So you have a velocity, you have a momentum, you have any velocity, you have any momentum, you have the corresponding energy, or with rotating objects in terms of angular momentum. But in quantum mechanics, especially when you have whenever your size of the system or the scale is comparable to, say, the Planck's constants, then you start seeing the effects of quantization and discretization, where you might remember, if you have taken a quantum class, that if you have a square well, then you have a certain energy levels are the only ones that would be allowed or available for particles to occupy. That same thing is true in atoms, right? Why do you think atoms have K, L, M, and shells? Like, what prevents them from having an energy between K and L? Like, why can't they stay somewhere else? So all this is all again a product of it comes from quantum mechanics. And finally, the most non-intuitive and just to preface, the first 2 points can still is, I mean, it was very surprising, but it could be understood within a wave mechanic picture, right? Because waves do have superposition, interference, diffraction, and standing waves do have quantized wavelengths. But when you talk about entanglement, it's like a totally different beast, and it is one of the most distinguishing features which has no classical analog. I will get into this like once we get into qubits, but just to put it out here for now. Okay, so so classical. I mean, before talking about quantum computers, it's necessary to also briefly talk about classical computers, which itself has undergone tremendous breakthroughs over the past many years, specifically by scaling down and integrating onto chips. But and some of you may also know that, okay, when we talk about classical computers, like in the sense of silicon chips, they're not, I mean, they are themselves possible because of quantum mechanics. Because remember that making these semiconductors, having logic gates, NMOS, CMOS, NMOS, PMOS logic, all that depends on having gateable semiconductors. And the semiconductor band theory itself is a product of, itself is a quantum theory. It's a quantum mechanical theory, and it can't be explained through just classical physics. However, even though you need quantum mechanics to understand or explain or to build classical computers, at the end of the day, the computing paradigm is still classical, in the sense that the bits are either 0 or 1, right? You build your NMOS, or and you say that when the current flows through the circuit, which means like a switch is closed, then you can say that, oh, my bit is 1. And then when you say this, when your switch is open, or you apply a gate voltage such that you don't have current flowing through your device, then you say the bit is 0. And this, you have this this exclusive, you can have either 0 or 1, and of course never both at the same time, because it's basically an operation of a switch. Then you collect, you make you have like this mega giga terabytes of 10 to the 9, 10 to the 12 number of bits. You run your algorithms and you do classical computing. But also, while there has been definitely progress, you also know that over the years, okay, people say the Moore's law is dying away, it never dies out. But over the years, people do say that you're getting towards the ultimate scaling limit, where you can't go below, you can't scale down below a few atoms. So, but just to preface, Moore's law is like, it's like this observation or a benchmark in the electronics industry, which says that every 2 years you double the size of, you double the number of transistors on your chip, or basically you half the size. And over the years, of course, since you have gone from like 130 nanometers to now, I think it's less than 14 also. But so people have, it's not like it's straightforward to just simply take it and scale it down, because it does take significant design challenges. Like you try tunnel field effect transistors, you try FinFETs, you use normal 2D materials such as molybdenum disulfide, and there has been a tremendous amount of work towards device and material engineering, especially to try and achieve this goal. But eventually, what's next? Like, you can't keep doing this. So this is one other reason why people are pushing towards a new computing paradigm, because at some point this is going to fade out. Although, just to say that they've been saying that Moore is going to die for for the past 20-30 years. So it may not seem as the most convincing reason, but we are indeed hitting the scaling limit. Okay, so that said, so what do you mean by a qubit? Remember, I told you Google's quantum computer has 53 qubits. So what is a qubit? A qubit, literally, it's just short for quantum bit. But what does that mean? So it's like you can understand it as a 2-level quantum system. So you can think of it as, say, the spin of an electron, which can either be pointing up or down, or basically just take, quantum mechanics allows, demands in some sense for the quantization or discretization of energy levels. So you pick a system which has a discrete 2 levels, 0, and label them as 0 and 1. And once you can have your particle or your system you can control it to be within these 2 states, then you say that you have a quantum bit. So essentially, it's like your classical bit switch on and off. There are 2 states. Similarly, you pick a quantum system which has 2 states, 2 energy levels. But here, since we are doing quantum mechanics, remember that superpositions are allowed. So yeah, I mean, this is so you can think of it. You might have heard of this famous thought experiment where you have Schrodinger's cat inside the box, and until you observe it, you don't know if it's dead or alive. So imagine like the two states, zero. This is just an example. I'm not suggesting that qubits are made using cats, but you can think of the two states of a system to be, when say the cat in the box is either dead or, okay, actually it's in, this looks dead. So when it's dead or alive, and you call the two states 0 and 1, and then once you and then you say that, okay, until I have seen my cat, until I've opened the box to see my cat, I have the cat being in a superposition of the two. So I can neither say it's dead or alive. In fact, it's both of this at the same time, or none at the same time. And mathematically, it's written in this form where alpha and beta can be any complex coefficients, whereas the 0 and 1 is like the states, and this plus operation just is used to say that you're in a superposition of the two states. And just to say that if you find any of this confusing, then like you are not alone, because no one really. Niels Bohr once said, like, if you understand quantum physics, then if you don't find this weird, then you have not understood it. So it's very counterintuitive to what we have been trained on, like what we have been used to thinking, and what we in fact see in our daily life, unless we go into like small systems. But so the idea is that you can have these two states where and you can have superpositions of them, and that is what is the new paradigm of computing, where you are deviating from having either a closed and an open switch. And why does so? You can right away think that, okay, this is, since alpha and beta are like these two numbers, just one quantum bit, you can have so many different states. It's like it opens up this this massive space of states that you can access, and some of the one of the groundbreaking algorithms which has really propelled quantum computing is called the Shor's factoring algorithm. So this also, it's like quite well known, so you might have heard about it, but just to give you a back, just to recap, it's like, in classic, that if you have to take, I don't know, these are like, I think 40 or 50 digits. If you have to multiply to 50 digit numbers and get some result like this, if you put it out, if you like say use a classical computer and try to do this, then it may take a millisecond, or maybe on a supercomputer even less, right? But if you give your if you give your classical computer this result, and you ask it, like, what two numbers did I multiply to get this, then it's like, it's a really, really hard problem, and there are no polynomial time algorithms to actually go back from the product to the two multiplicants. And this is in fact what most of the RSA encryption is based on. So it's based on the fact that you can't, like, the secret key in a code is based on the fact that factoring a large number is a hard problem, and whereas multiplying the two may not be. But however, like using quantum, this paradigm of quantum computing with qubits, Peter Shor in 1994 he came up with an algorithm which basically, in terms of complexity theory, takes this is the complexity. I don't know if it may mean something to you, it may not mean something, but what you need to know is that it's almost exponentially faster than the most efficient known classical factoring algorithm that we know today. So I won't have time to go into this algorithm per se, but I'm trying to motivate the hype, or not the hype, but motivate why people are so interested in thinking about quantum computing. And you can see this is not a new thing. It's 1994, so 27 years. But but still today we are still struggling to or we are making small breakthroughs. So this shows the challenges that come with with trying to build a quantum computer. You not only need to have the theory and the uh, yeah the algorithms ready, but you also need significant experimental progress to take you through that. Okay, with that said, I'll quickly talk about the block sphere, because this is like a very important way of representing qubits. Like you can remember in classical bits, you can say like switches, right? You can talk about switches, or you can talk about coins, heads or tails. So it's either 0 or 1. But it was already difficult to think about qubits, because it's like, okay, you have two states, but I said you can have a superposition of any of them. So how do you really think of how do you get a picture of them? So yeah, one way is this is the most conventional way of representing qubits today, and it's that. So I said that a qubit in general can be written like this, where it's alpha times 0 plus beta times 1. So you'd consider a spherical surface on a three-dimensional in a three-dimensional space, and then you say the two poles are the two states, right? Are the two levels, and I'm going to refer to the 0 and 1 as basis states, because in the language of linear algebra, this is in some sense taking the span over the two basis vectors. Let's say you 0 and 1 are basis vectors, then your qubit is basically a linear combination of them, so it lies within the vector space. But anyway, don't worry about all of that. You can take these two the two levels of the qubit to be the two poles of the sphere, and once you do that, it's then you can see that any point on the sphere basically represents a superposition of the two qubit states. So one way to look at that is that you can pick any. Let's say your qubit, you instead of parameterizing it as alpha and beta, you write it in terms of the spherical coordinates as cos theta over 2 and sin theta over 2 with a phase factor here. Then you can uniquely take this point and point it to you can map this point or you can map this state or this qubit onto a particular point on spherical space. So this point has coordinates theta and phi, and so you can take your qubit and map it on to a point on the sphere of your on the surface of your block sphere. Why is this useful? Because it's like, again, first of all, it gives you a way to visualize where you are on the space of all possible qubits, and number two, it's like also when you're designing like controls or algorithms to see what happens to your qubits when you apply a particular signal, or when you build an algorithm, then this provides a very pictorial and interpretive understanding. And just as a sanity check, you can confirm that, okay, when theta is 0, you indeed have the 0 state, which is one of the two states. Whereas when theta is 180 degrees or pi, the qubit is down here. Whereas, you can point along the equator when you have theta is to be 90. So you'll find this a very useful thing even when you do your Qiskit Qiskit programs, because there you can, when you apply a gate and then you see what happens to the qubit that you started with, then it will be very useful to have this picture in mind. Okay, so now I think so we all, I spoke about how having qubits gives you this massive space of states that you can access, because alpha and beta can be complex numbers, and you can, by taking superposition of the two basis states, the 0 and the 1, you can go anywhere on your sphere, right? So I said that you have these two states to start with. Let's say this means the cat is dead, the cat is alive. Then taking just a superposition of them, you are like anywhere on the sphere. So it seems like wow, you have so much just with one qubit. But but there is a small intricacy about what goes on with measuring a qubit, and I want to illustrate that using this experiment by Stern and Gerlach, which is quite instructional in thinking about quantum two level quantum systems. So what they did in this experiment was that they took an oven and which they took an oven which basically projected out silver atoms, and using a collimating slit, they focused the silver atoms along, let's say, a particular y direction, whereas they had these irregularly shaped magnets which created an inhomogeneous field along the z direction. So you have now silver atoms propagating along the y direction, whereas you have an inhomogeneous field along the z direction. And you know from classical electrodynamics that, let's say, if your silver atoms have a magnetic moment which is given by mu z, which is the magnetic moment in the z direction, then the force that they experience will be proportional to the gradient of mu z times bz, because the field is along the z direction. And so you'll in effect get a force. I mean, each silver atom will experience a force of this order, and you can see that the force that it experiences is proportional to the magnetic moment of the silver atoms in the z direction. Now, since the oven is like spitting out silver atoms which like point in all possible directions, you like, what would you expect? Like, I mean, I'm telling you that the force is going to be proportional to the z direction, the z component of the magnetic moment, whereas these silver atoms, which are each of which are tiny magnets, are like pointing in all random directions. So the expectation would be, well, I mean, we would see like some sort of like distribution, obviously centered at the peak, but in general it would be pointing in all different directions. So you may see some Gaussian profile like this. But like, to everyone's amazement at that time, what they actually saw was they saw on the detector screen just two bright spots, and not a uniform or not a Gaussian distribution of all possible spots. So this was very surprising at the time, but eventually it was understood as the fact that, okay, you have your so I said that your silver atoms point in all possible directions. So if you think of the tiny magnet as a quantum system with, say, upspin and downspin as the two states, as 0 and 1, then until here, right, just before the magnet, or even let's say here, the spins are pointing in all different directions. So one way to describe it is to say that, it's like just a superposition of the upspin and downspin, which means it's anywhere on the block sphere. It's pointing in any possible direction. But when you measure it, like when you have the screen and you actually look at, it hit the screen where, what you're using the screen to get information about its orientation, right? So the screen is like a measurement device. You're saying, I look at the screen, I look at the spot, and I say, and I'll ask myself where it came from, what was its direction. The moment you try to do that, you see, there are only two spots. So the two spots, in fact, correspond to the case when the silver atom was either pointing directly was upspin or downspin. So this is it's like an interpretation of quantum mechanics, that whenever you have a quantum state, let's say, which is a superposition of its two basis states, and you try to make a measurement, which in this case is using a screen, then it will instantly collapse into one of the two states. So you can't ever measure this directly. You can't measure this for all alphas and betas. When you do a one-shot measurement, or when you do a measurement of this sort, you'll either see one of the two outcomes, and those would be the corresponding points which would get lit up on the detector screen. So in order to show this on the block sphere, you're actually just going to see either the red arrow or the blue arrow. That's all when you do a measurement. So it's in your it's your responsibility to design a quantum algorithm, a quantum circuit in such a way that you don't lose information, but at the same time you are aware of this limitation, or this, I wouldn't say it's a limitation, it's like a property of quantum mechanics. So just to put this in context, I mean, just to summarize this, when you have this quantum states and you say you're making a z direction measurement because you have a z direction magnet on a screen, you'll either measure either 0 or 1. That's it. And obviously the probabilities of 0 and 1 will depend on the coefficients. So if you have multiple, if you have enough enough silver atoms that you can actually do a statistical analysis, then you can compute these probabilities and then compute what alpha, at least the magnitude of alpha and beta. And there is another interesting thing which may or may not be obvious, is that once you this by this box, I'm just trying to capture this whole setup, okay, which is the magnet and the screen. Let's say you have this actually not this magnet and the screen. So so you have this, let's say you have the randomly pointing silver atoms going through your Stern-Gerlach setup, and you somehow block the one states, right? You will block the ones which result in the bright spot below the central region, and you only send the top ones out. So you have two things coming out. You block this, whereas you send the top ones out towards, and this is just a thought experiment, okay? So don't worry about how would one do this in the lab, but it can be done. But let's not get to this at this point. So you just take the spins pointing along the top along 0, and you send it to another Stern-Gerlach setup. So you take the spins which show up here, or the atoms that show up here, and you send it through another setup. So you start again, you take that and you send it into another setup, so another magnet and another screen. And then you'll see that you only get the top. So by h bar over 2, I just mean 0. So you'll only get 0 back. So this again points to the fact that, you had this qubit which was like a superposition. You made the measurement, it collapsed into 0 or 1. It collapsed into 0. You send it through another setup. You will only see 0. So this is something which is again non-intuitive, but it's important to keep in mind. You make the measurement, it collapses, and then it stays there unless you give it enough time to dynamically evolve. Okay, and so all this that I spoke right now was about just having one qubit. You already saw the possibilities. I mean, you have this block sphere for one qubit, which gives you such a big space with the caveat of the measurement basis. But the vector space itself grows exponentially with the number of qubits. Let's say let's say instead of 1, you have 2 qubits, where by this notation, I just mean that the first qubit is 0, the second qubit is 0, whereas this means the first qubit is 0, second qubit is 1. So if you have a 2 qubit system, like you start with 2 qubits, so let's imagine 2 boxes with a cat in each of them, then you have 4 basis states, right? And then the state of the quantum bits would then live in a 4-dimensional complex vector space. Similarly, with 3 qubits, you go into an 8-dimensional vector space, and with n, you can imagine this keeps growing 16, 32. So it's tremendous. Like this is one other reason why it's so much more powerful. I mean, of course, you have superposition, and I will show you about entanglement soon. But the growth of dimensionality with the number of qubits is a big reason why the computational advantage is so good. Okay, and just to complete this story about 2 qubit states in particular, since I promised to talk to you about entanglement, I just want to briefly. So this is like this is a tremendous feature about a very characteristic feature of quantum mechanics, and I can't do justice to it in just talking about it in 1 or 2 slides, but just wanted to show you how non-intuitive it can be. So you like this. For example, if you just assume, if you just start with this 2-qubit state, right? It's 2 qubits because it has 2 indices per. So this this curly. So I didn't introduce this, but this notation which I'm using, which is a straight line and a right angle. An L bracket is actually called the Dirac's notation, and this is called a ket, which is used to denote a column vector or a wave function. And so if you start with this 2-qubit state where I'm labeling the qubits, so it's like a superposition. This plus means it's a superposition. It's a superposition of the first qubit being 0, so the A qubit being 0 and the B qubit being 1, and the A qubit being 1 and the B qubit being 0, right? It's a superposition. Then you'll notice that there is no way to actually factorize or separate this into like a state for A and a state for B. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, you can't, for no alpha, beta, gamma, delta, can you ever write this state in this form where I have separated out the A part and the B part, right? And just to, just in case of any confusion, what I mean by that is 0A times 0B is in fact, 0A times 1B is in fact this term here, and 1A times 0B is this term here. But you can clearly see that for any alpha, beta, gamma, delta, you can not get this, right? So this has profound implications. So, and one of which is the correlation that exists between the 2 bits. Let's say you have this qubit, okay? You have this 2-qubit state. It's like 2 qubits, right? Qubit A and qubit B. You take qubit A and let's say you do this again. You put it into a Stern-Gerlach measurement, and for that moment, assume that you only see 0. Okay, you don't see 1. You only see a 0. So then, what are you learning by this measurement? You're learning that, oh, if I take qubit A and if I do the Stern-Gerlach measurement, I'm finding it to be in the state 0. So since I just told you that once you do a measurement, you collapse into the state that you measured, and that is the state that you remain in until you let it evolve. So if you have to measure if you ended up measuring a 0 for qubit A, then definitely out of this, in this qubit, your 2-qubit state would have collapsed into this one, the 0A and the 1B, right? Because only if it collapses into 0A and 1B, can you, let me just put it another way. You measured the qubit A and it collapsed into 0, right? So if you look at the state, the 2-qubit state, then if I'm telling you that, oh, my qubit A is in state 0, then I have no choice, right? I mean, the qubit B has to be in 1, because that's how the qubit is initialized or is set up. So if the qubit A is in 0, then the qubit B is in state 1. Whereas if this was in 1, the other one would be in 0. So what I'm trying to say is that just by making a local measurement on A, I don't even need to make a measurement on B, but I know what B is. So I say that I measure A, I find it to be 0, then I know for certain that B is 1. Whereas if I made the measurement and found A to be in 1, then I know for certain that B is 0. So, after the measurement of the first particle, a measurement of the second particle will always be opposite to the spin of the first, or the spin or the state, whatever. So this amount of correlation that exists between the two is something which is very non-classical, and it's also non-local. Like if I'm telling you that you can make a local measurement on A, what I'm basically telling you is you have a 2-qubit state and you can separate them. You just measure A, and then you can tell the guy who has B that, oh, you are going to measure this. So it's like this amount of non-local correlations is like very non-intuitive, and this has been demonstrated in the lab. So it's just not some hypothesis of mathematical theory. This is a very intrinsic part of quantum mechanics, and there have been measurements to show this non-ambiguously. Okay, and so what I showed you here was just one of the Bell states, whereas there are in fact 4 of them, each with different combinations of the A and B qubit and the different signs here for the superposition. And these are in fact what are called as 2-qubit basis of maximally entangled states, because there exists a quantitative notion of how entangled are 2 qubits, right? If I just give you, say, 2 qubits which are of this form, psi and psi b, then you can say that, oh, the entanglement is 0, because I can separate them, and if I know what A is, that gives me no information about B. But so you can then, similarly for different states, you can have this quantification of what a 2-qubit, how much is the entanglement that you actually have. With this amount of background, I think it's time to look back at what the quantum supremacy story was. So basically what Google did in their paper in October was, so they asked the question, okay, what can we do to show, what can we do, like what problem can we design, or what can we ask our quantum computer to do that a classical computer cannot, or is there something that a quantum computer is good at but a classical computer cannot, or would be very slow at? Then, the natural, if you think about it in hindsight, then the natural thing that quantum computers can do is to be quantum, or in other words, is to be random. Like, I said, you have the superposition, you do a measurement, you get probabilistic answers. Right? You get 0 with a probability mod alpha square, you measure 1 with probability mod beta square. So you just let this computer behave randomly. Of course, don't take myself literally, but they took this thought process and designed an experiment where their goal was to compute the probability distribution of all the possible outcomes of a quantum random number generator. So random number generators are like the code that you write in Python or C. They are like, of course, not true random numbers, because there exists an underlying code which just has different seeds to spit you out the numbers, but they are pseudo random numbers. But if you can, quantum processes or quantum measurements are intrinsically random, so you can expect that a quantum circuit or a quantum device would generate random outcomes. So the goal of their experiment was to compute the probability distribution of all the outcomes of a quantum random number generator. So basically, they were the ones who were generating the random numbers, and they had to do they had to just run their device to try and build the histogram and get the probability distribution. So this took them, so they had 53 qubits. It took them 3 minutes and 20 seconds to get this distribution, right? And for now, if I tell you, okay, I'm giving you the same problem, but I'm not giving you the Google Sycamore quantum computer, then what you will do, you will take a supercomputer and you'll try and write a code to simulate all the physics that goes on within the Sycamore. So you'll write down the Schrodinger equation, you'll write down how the qubits behave, what are the physical processes that go on, what creates the randomness, how do I write a code that would simulate that randomness. You will have to do all of this. I'm not saying it's that people don't know how to do this. It's obviously, you know the physics, you know the equations, you code it up, you do it. But the complexity grows tremendously. Like I told you, even with 2 qubits, with like n qubits, it grows as 2 to the n, right? The dimensions that you have to work with. They have 53 qubits here. So it's like tremendous. I think like in Google's paper, they estimated that with the Summit supercomputer in Oak Ridge National Labs in Tennessee, they estimated it taking 10,000 years to do the same measurement. So it's interesting. Yeah. So this is the story about Google, and as I said, it instantly caused a lot of hype. But the very same day, there was a blog by IBM where they said that you can read it if you can in the bottom right, which says that we argue that the ideal simulation of the same task can be performed in 2.5 days and not 10,000. So they said that, okay, so obviously, so they said, if you design a better classical algorithm to run on your supercomputers, then you can, you don't need to wait for 10,000 years. So it's not that much of a quantum advantage that you are proposing. So, you can, there are like the people are split about this. Some say that oh, they're doing a useless task. Who cares about probability distributions of random numbers? I mean, yeah, it's not like something that's imminently useful. And second of all, how do you really say it's much better when someone says you can do it in 2.5 days? But the other side of the story is that the other set of people think, well, I mean, sure, it's not something that's useful, and I can't use it to build a computer that I would want. But it's at least a breakthrough, and like it's a demonstration of a fundamental principle that, okay, it's useless, I agree, but it's something that proves it gives experimental verification to this notion we had of quantum computers doing doing at least certain tasks much faster than classical ones. So I mean, nobody will agree on one thing, but it's very interesting to follow this and see how this field has evolved. Okay, I wanted to check how much time do I have left. Roshni or Malvika, can you tell me how much time can I go on for?
Yeah, you can take it till about, say, 9:45 if you wish to. Anytime between 9:30 to
9:45. Okay, now it's what time?
It's
9:20 now. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I have a few more. Okay, I'll go on for a little more. But if you have questions, I hope you stop me, because it's difficult on Zoom to gauge what you're getting and not getting. Okay. I just want to, with this background, I just wanted to introduce quantum logic gates, because I think these are an important part of the Qiskit workshops that you'll be working on. I mean, you will truly see why they're useful only once you start doing your Qiskit tutorials. So at this point, it may just seem like what is the use of this? But anyway, just to go on with it, let's just for notational convenience, let us since everything is a linear theory and you can use linear algebra to talk about vector spaces and orthogonality, it's easier to represent the qubits, the two states of the qubits as this column vector. So the 0 state is 1 0, whereas 1 is 0 1, and this instantly tells you that, okay, they are orthogonal to each other, right? By orthogonal, I mean if you start in the state 0, and if I ask you what is the probability that you measure 1, then it is 0, and that is what was the assumptions we started with. It's like two antipodal points on the Bloch sphere, up and down. Okay. So the most basic and heavily used, I would say, gates are called the Pauli gates, and the name comes from the Pauli spin operators, which are used to, say, understand the Stern-Gerlach experiment. And so these are single qubit gates. What do I mean by that? They act on single qubits, so like two-dimensional complex vector spaces, and these are their matrix representations. So I should mention one thing. The way you can think about quantum operations is that you can have a gate acting on a bit to give you another bit, right? I mean, a gate acts on a state on some point, and it takes you somewhere else on the Bloch sphere. That is how you can think about qubits. The way it's easier to represent on like a mathematical framework is to have matrices. So you have for the X gate, you have a 2x2 matrix. You multiply it with a column vector, which is either 0 and 1, and you get out another column vector. So and it's easy to see for 2x2 at least, without actually working it out, that when you take X to the 0 state, you see that you end up with a 1 state, right? Because you multiply 1 0 with this, and you'll end up with 0 1. So X gate is called also it's used to flip. It's basically it's used to flip a bit. So if you're at 0 and you apply an X gate, you're basically going to 1. So it's like a flip around the X axis. That's why it's called the X gate. Similarly, Y is a flip around the Y axis, and Z is 180 degree. I mean, these all are 180 degree flips around the corresponding axes. Of course, Z gate would not do anything if you're already on the Z axis, right? If you're on 0, then it will stay there. If you're 1, you'll stay there. You'll pick up a negative sign, but you can't do anything with negative sign. I mean, just having a negative sign, you can't measure that. You just measure probabilities. So yeah, these are the single qubit gates. I mean, these are a few of them. The other one, which is very important, is called the Hadamard gate. Yeah, so this is a gate which induces superpositions, right? How do you think about that? Because let's say you act this gate upon 0, which is say 1 0, right? Which is a column vector 1 0. Then you'll end up with a column vector which is 1 1. And what does 1 1 mean? 1 1 is basically just a superposition between 0 and 1. It's like you're adding these two column vectors. With the square root of 2, you don't need to worry about it right now. It's just used to normalize things so that probability still makes sense and everything is less than 1. But yeah, otherwise, Hadamard gate induces like if you start with 0 and 1, which is what your computational basis is called, yeah, you acted with the Hadamard gate, you will get superposition. So it will take you from 0 to say on the equator, and the equator is where you have the superpositions because you have an equal contribution of 0 and 1, and it means that your theta in the Bloch sphere picture was 90 degrees. Okay, and yeah, you can also have some gates like this. This is called a phase shift gate. So what this does is that if you are in one state, if your qubit is 1, then it'll add a phase here. This phase is a phase of 90 degrees or I, like the complex imaginary number I. Whereas if you're in one, it'll keep you there. So I mean, again, as I told you, this may seem rather abstract right now, but once you get to actually looking into simple algorithms, then it will, like in the Qiskit notebooks, these things will be very handy. Yeah. And so since we have talked about this, it's also important, I think, to distinguish between two. I guess there are many paradigms, but at least two broad paradigms of quantum computing. This first is what you guys would be using in this workshop, is to use IBM's quantum computer and build quantum circuits. So you have, say in this picture, you have 5 qubits, and you do a, by the way, I just want to say, I've not told you about all the gates. Okay, there are these 2 qubit gates, and there are, yeah, there's this Tifoli gate. There are a lot of gates. And then you can ask the question of, what is a universal gate set? Because, in classical computers, that NAND, if you know that, then in using a NAND gate, you can build any logic gate, and you can do quantum. You can build a computer using just NAND gates, right? I mean, the logic part, not the memory. I mean, yeah. So you can build a logic of a classical computer using NAND gates. Similarly, for quantum circuits, there do exist some universal gate sets, and yeah, you can be curious and find out about that. But what I wanted to briefly tell you here is this paradigm of quantum computing, which is called the quantum circuits, or it's also known as digital quantum computing. Yes, as you have digital electronics, where you build, you take these gates, you connect them together. You start with qubits on one end, and you do the measurements on the other end. So all these are called measurements. You make a measurement, you measure either 0 or 1. Yeah. So this is one way, very. I mean, that's what Google invented, and it's like a very scalable, I would say, or I don't know. It's a very popular way to do quantum computing, right? But there's a very different setup, which is actually called a quantum simulation, or it's also called analog quantum simulation. And now this is this is a paradigm in which you build either, so it's either based on solid states like quantum dots, which are like really, really small confinements of electrons, or it's commonly used in like cold atoms. So you can trap cold atoms or ion traps into a lattice, and the goal of this paradigm is to try and simulate materials or physics which are otherwise difficult to engineer. Let's say I wanted to understand how some heavy fermion materials work. Now, if this word doesn't mean anything, then it's fine. But let's say high temperature superconductors. You might have heard about high temperature superconductors. These are superconductors, which conventional ones are conventional ones like aluminum or niobium. You need like liquid helium or colder temperatures to get them to superconductor. But certain novel, strongly interacting systems can superconduct at higher temperatures. So how do you understand them? Like, do you always need to go to like the materials lab and find the material and study them, or can I build a system in my lab using different materials which tries and simulates that system here? So I know I cannot simulate a high temperature superconductor and understand it using a classical computer, because the dynamics and the correlations are just too much for me to control. But what if I can build a system here? So this is just a quantum dot system. Okay, so this has nothing to do with high temperature superconductors or magnetism or anything. But what if I can build this? So this involves traditional CMOS technology. I mean, you go to a fab facility and you can do this. What if I build this here and appropriately tune my device parameters and the design in such a way that I can I can make its Hamiltonian look like that of a high temperature superconductor or a heavy fermion material. Then in some sense I've actually simulated that behavior in my lab or in my device. So this is also in some sense, it's not, it may be unconventional when you compare it with classical computers of today, but this is also a way of doing quantum computing, where using these controls, you tune the parameters so that you are actually, for all purposes that you care about, you have a high temperature superconductor in your lab, even though you don't really have the material. So this is the other kind, and this is the area in which I actually work on. So where I am building these quantum dot arrays to try and study non-Fermi liquid physics. So if you know about that, then it's like a physics of strongly correlating materials, where the well-known results from Fermi liquid theory or weak interactions don't apply. But yeah, this is another very interesting aspect, which is unfortunately difficult to work on in a workshop. But you should also know that the circuits are not the only thing. Okay. I think so. I have a few more slides about hardware. Like how do you actually do quantum computing? Some architectures like NMR or superconducting qubits. But I feel like if I start that, I may not be able to give it enough time and it'll go much faster. So I think it's okay to stop right now, but we can definitely take questions, and maybe in the future, if you all are interested, we can talk also about the architectures. But about quantum computing, broad overview, this is all I had. And while there have been a lot of progress, I can also briefly just tell you that while Google, IBM are all, like IBM the ones you're going to use, or Google the ones that is there in the news, all those are based on the so-called superconducting qubits, which is like an architecture for doing quantum computing. It's basically the answer to the question that you will ask as to where are these two states, or what are these two states. I mean, obviously you don't have cats in there, so what do I mean by 0 and 1? So that's when you talk about architectures and what are the devices. So the most scalable one I think today, or the most highly used one, is are superconducting qubits, but there exist like many other promising technologies like spin qubits and topological qubits, which are picking up, and a lot of people are working on them towards making quantum computers. Okay, I think with that I'll stop talking, but I'm happy to take any questions about this or anything else in general.
Praveen, there are quite a few questions in the chat. Just to make it easier for you, one of our conveners, Sachin, will just moderate the questions for you, which are still unanswered.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
More than questions, it's like a discussion of sorts.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said earlier, you should have stopped me because I'm not able to look at the chat. But anyway, I think we can talk right now.
Yeah. So I think it would be best if like whoever has a question just unmute themselves and ask, because
Am I audible?
yes, you are.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, how would you develop an algorithm for qubits?
Okay. So of course, there is no like general recipe. Like it's a very problem specific question. So yeah, I mean, I mean, like developing any algorithm, right? It takes. I mean, I don't know how to answer that question. It takes, of course, a lot of creativity, and you need to know about what you can and cannot do with quantum mechanics. But I mean, in general, you have this bag of tools, like these gates that you can use to that you can apply on your qubits. You know what each gate does. So an algorithm would look like you take a qubit, you apply the set of gates, and I mean, yeah, and then depending on the outcome, you may.
Can you explain it through example from like Shor's algorithm or something?
So I think Shor's algorithm. I mean, those algorithms are. Those algorithms will, it's a bit hard to go through all of that right now. But like will you in your Qiskit, will you be doing some, I don't know, either teleportation or super dense coding or something which is more straightforward? Then it will be easier to get through that.
Yeah, actually in the modules we have teleportation as well as like we have a couple of algorithms. And
okay.
The books, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just briefly talk about teleportation. It may not work. It may not sound very reasonable because it's best if someone actually writes it down. But since I don't have that written down right now, I can just briefly say. So in the teleportation protocol, it's like a protocol where you have Alice and Bob are the two parties, which and they share an entangled pair. Okay, so they share one of those Bell states, which I told you about. And let's say so and the goal, sorry, what is the goal? Teleportation, the goal is Alice has a state and she wants to send it to send the state to Bob. And there is something in quantum mechanics called as the no cloning theorem. So she can't really make a copy of that and just send it like how you would do in classical bits. So the way the protocol works is that there's an entangled pair, a Bell pair, which they share, which means Alice has one part of it, Bob has the other part of it. So what Alice does is that she has a qubit, which is one qubit, and she has one qubit from the Bell pair. And using the two of them, she does a joint measurement. She does a measurement onto a Bell basis to find one of the four states being collapsed after the measurement. And she then, depending on the result of that measurement, she will just use a classical communication channel and tell Bob, oh, I did this measurement on my qubit and one of the qubits that we shared, and this is what I got. So you need to do a corresponding operation on the second half of the Bell pair that you had, and you will get exactly what I had. So again, I'm saying all this in words and it's not going to make any sense. But the general paradigm is like you put some gates together, and so the first step is you initialize your qubits. You start with the 0, 0 or 1, 1, and you get somewhere where you want. Then you do your operations, and then finally you do your measurements. And you can pick up an algorithm and go through it and see how it's done. But yeah, that's the broad idea.
Okay, thank you.
There's one question from Shashank. He's asking like why there are specifically two basis states. Like won't any finite number of state work? Like, or is it related to the classical bits?
It's like a very good question, and I mean, just the short answer is a qubit, right? A bit means two states. So conceptually speaking, a qubit has two states, 0 and 1. You can also think about qubits, which are like three-state systems, 0, 1, and 2. And then so this is just a conceptual notion of how you want to, what paradigm you want to design and work with. Of course, having more and more states will make it difficult to control. Because if you have a qubit, then you have just two states, and all your concern is how you would go between the two states. Whereas if you have, say, 3 states or 4 states, if you have a ladder of states, then when you apply your control signal to change the qubit from 0 to 1, you have to be careful as to not overdo it to like take it to 2 or 3, and then it just is a. I mean, of course, there are ways to get around it. You can like make the energy spacings so that they don't interfere. But yeah, to answer it short, a qubit, by the word bit, you mean 2 states. Yeah. But of course, in physical systems, there are multiple states, so you have to work around it and design it in such a way that only 2 states are what are going to be important.
In the chat, I don't see any other specific questions. If anyone has any questions, they can unmute themselves and ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to could you give an example of what quantities are 0 and 1 measuring? As in, what is the quantity? Like in digital, it was voltage. So what are the eigen values of which that?
One example, I think, which is the simplest example, is say the spin of an electron. Like, I mean, I showed you the Stern-Gerlach experiment where you are shooting silver atoms through an inhomogeneous field, and you're using a screen to detect it. So there, of course, you had like all sorts of. So basically, the 2 states in that are whether the spin of the silver atom. I mean, a spin is basically just you can think of it as a magnet, right? A magnet which is intrinsic to the silver atom. Then you can think of it as the 2 states, 0 and 1, being whether it points up or it points down. So the way you would do it, like simplest way I can, the simplest way I can think of is, one way to do it is if you take, let's say, carbon or nitrogen, then the nucleus of these atoms have a spin, like they have a nuclear spin, which basically what I'm saying is they have a magnetic moment, so they're pointing in some direction. Now, if you impinge it with microwave pulses of a particular frequency which corresponds to the energy difference between the up and the down spin, then you'll be able to measure what exactly whether it's pointing up or it's pointing down. So the goal is, okay, you have these 2 spins up and down, you apply a magnetic field such that the up spin and the down spin have different energies, okay? And then that is your 2-level system. Your up spin has some energy E0, your down spin has some energy E1, and the separation between the two levels that form because of the non-degenerate levels is what your 2-level system is.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Is there any other questions? Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if it is a silly question, but I understand what this quantum behavior. I have studied this Stern-Gerlach and all, but I'm not really able to see how we are making this jump from this quantum behavior to the computers. Like, what is what do we mean by that? Like, we talk about how is it relevant with the computers?
Yeah. No, that's a very valid question, and I've definitely not spoken about that today. So I think one way to think about this is that I think one way you can convince yourself about. I mean, of course, I gave you the motivations that using 1 qubit, it gives you the computational space. I mean, okay, yeah. What do you mean by computational space? So I said that, okay, you have these 2 levels, 0 and 1. You can think of that as the bits, and since you are allowed to have superpositions, it gives you more freedom. Number two is that's number one. Number two is that you can with the number of qubits that you have, your dimensionality increases. So while you had one sphere for a single qubit, you have much larger spaces. So it's just that what is the key crux of everything is that the information that you can encode using a qubit. See, finally, what do computers do? They need information processing. They need information processing devices, and then you write code to play around with that, right? So what the idea is that about quantum computing, one of that is that the information processing paradigm is different. So it's like gives you an enormous space. Number two is that with number of qubits it grows exponentially, and number three is that you have this new thing of entanglement where you can have, this is very key actually, otherwise there's not really anything to quantum computing. But yeah, the key thing about entanglement is that you can have two bits, you can have two bits which actually talk to each other. So if you do one operation the other, so you know what has happened on you do one operation on one of them, you know what has happened to the other. So it's of course it's very abstract what I'm saying right now, but the crux I think you should keep in mind is the way that the information is stored and processed or manipulated is it's very different, and that is what allows, I mean, since it's a very different paradigm, it lets you achieve things which cannot be done otherwise. And about the Google experiment in particular, they focus on randomness. Of course, a quantum system is the best to do randomness because it is inherently probabilistic. So that's a more specific example of what has been shown today.
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask about it's out of context what we are discussing right now, but I want to ask that MSc chemistry student can also work on the quantum computing in the quantum lab. Is the chemistry student?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's like a very multidisciplinary subject, and chemistry, in fact, I mean, I don't know if you've heard about quantum chemistry, but it's like a very, very hot topic at the moment because, as you know, like, I mean, once you have like a few molecular orbitals or like a molecule with few degrees of freedom, it becomes incredibly difficult to simulate its dynamics on a classical computer or its behavior on a classical computer. So, I mean, to try and understand how to try and solve chemistry of strongly interacting or strongly correlated materials is one of the big pushes of big goals of quantum mechanics, of quantum computing. And chemistry students are involved in a major way, not only in refining this goal and working towards it, but also in the material side, or it's like a very multidisciplinary field. So chemistry, I mean, don't feel like you have to be constrained by what your department is or not, because it's very, very open and multidisciplinary.
So chemistry student also can apply for PhD position for the quantum computing sector, I mean, research project.
I mean, I don't think that's going to be a problem. You just have to show that you have the interest and the potential to work on it. But that department, like chemistry is not chemistry is definitely one of the major departments which works on this.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? If not, we can end this meeting here.
Okay.
You can send your mail address. Can you give, if we have any doubt, we can mail you, Praveen.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I can. I'll share it via the organizers.
Yeah. We'll post it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Will there be any follow-up session? As far as the workshop for the PG's course. After this, there will be and there will be different modules, and it has all the conceptual knowledge as well as with Qiskit. And after that, we have a talk at the end, but and that is again open to all, and we'll inform you soon about that as well.
Hello, I want to ask just one last question to Praveen.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask that, as you said, that for getting PhD, you have to show them the potential and like. So, can you give some advice for it if you want to get a good position in quantum lab? So, what should you what should you how we do better? For the quantum.
There is no single answer to that. Yeah, there is no single answer to this. But I just what I meant by that is that you should demonstrate that you have some interest and have taken some steps, like maybe taken classes or maybe try to work on some research project with a professor or something. So, I am not saying that, there is no prescription of what you need to do. If you want, you can talk offline and about what your interests are. What I meant to say is that you should not feel constrained by your department is so and so I'm not fit for this. That's not true at all. Like, people have come from all sorts of places, so it's chemistry, and that too is very much within the main theme of quantum computing. So that's what I meant, and of course we can talk later about what your interests are and what you can do. But I just wanted to say that once you have the interest and you have taken a few steps in whatever way you have opportunities, that's more.
Thank you.
Okay, finally we come to the end of this event, and I would like to thank Praveen for this most highly informative event, and also it was very nice to have you here. Thank you, Praveen.
Yeah, so I guess I'll end the meet right now. Thank you so much, everyone.
And also, guys, stay tuned for more events on quantum computing. There are many more coming up soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye.